Gearbox has been really generous with buffs in Borderlands 3, with weapons, shields, and even character skills constantly getting buffed. They've buffed so many things at this point that it is near impossible to keep track of all of them. However, there are still a few guns that seem to have been neglected by the huge waves of buffs. A lot of these guns have either gotten very minimal buffs or basically none at all. Hey everyone, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is the 5 guns in Borderlands 3 that desperately need a buff. Before we get into the list, I just want to say a lot of this is obviously going to be opinion based. I know a lot of guns are in need of a buff, but I'm interested to know what guns you would like to see receive a buff in Borderlands 3. Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're there, why not drop a like and a subscribe. Starting off the list, we have the Carrier. The Carrier was a really cool concept, especially as someone who used to play StarCraft when I was younger. However, it just doesn't actually hurt anything past basic mob enemies, and that's really disappointing. The way this weapon works is, for every bullet that hits an enemy, an additional 2 projectiles will spawn and home in on other enemies. The Carrier was at least a little usable, until the exploit that created extra projectiles for each elemental damage source was patched. When that exploit was patched, this weapon went from releasing a huge storm of drones per shot to releasing 2 per shot, and that basically destroyed any hope this gun had of being good, especially considering this gun can't even spawn with its own element. I don't think this gun would take much to be good. Just increase the damage and the amount of drones released per bullet hit, and that should be more than enough to make it really awesome. I personally would love to see this gun get buffed to be a useful weapon at endgame. Next up we have the Bitch. The Bitch was a gun that was first introduced all the way back in the original Borderlands, and it probably flew under the radar of a lot of players in Borderlands 2, as it dropped from the same boss as the Sham. It also wasn't that good in Borderlands 2, so it was never really worthwhile to farm. Fast forward 7 years to Borderlands 3 and it's still pretty much the exact same story. The Bitch still isn't that great, and it drops from Tyreen the Destroyer, who drops the King and Queen's Calls, which was at one point a very meta pistol. I personally didn't even know that the Bitch was in Borderlands 3 until I was farming for the King and Queen's Calls from Tyreen, and she dropped this instead. However, this gun was one of my favorite from Borderlands 2, and I always wanted it to do better than it did. This gun definitely isn't the worst gun in the game, and it really wouldn't take a huge buff to make it viable in the endgame, but it definitely needs some sort of buff, and I would love for it to get buffed so I could finally enjoy this awesome weapon in Borderlands 3. Another gun that really needs a buff is the Shreddifier. The Shreddifier at one point was a super meta gun for Moes. If you were a Moes main, this was the gun to farm for a bottomless mags build. It was perfect for the playstyle with high DPS and a ginormous magazine size that could regenerate super quick. However, after a large amount of power creep, the Shreddifier's power slowly but surely took a dive. The Shreddifier was a gun that was essentially made for Moes, and the fact that it isn't even useful come Mayhem 11 or even lower Mayhem levels is super sad. This gun doesn't need much to become great again either. Just a significant damage increase would make this gun an A tier weapon once again. This next gun is another one that I very rarely see anybody talking about, and that is the Warlord. The Warlord is a brand new gun that was first introduced in this game, and honestly it's one of my favorite guns in this game, which is why it's so sad for me to see how poorly it performs. The Warlord is a pretty simple gun. It's a dull assault rifle that has a really big magazine size and a 33% chance to not consume ammo when firing the gun. The Warlord did get a few minor buffs, but it hasn't really been enough, and the Warlord is still not strong enough to do anything to enemies in the endgame. To be honest, this one is obviously more of a personal entry on the list for me since it is one of my favorite guns in the game, but I really want to see this gun get buffed. The last weapon on this list is one that really needs a big buff, and that is the Hellfire. Anyone who's been playing Borderlands since the first game knows how much of a legend this gun was. The Hellfire was one of the most overpowered SMGs in the original Borderlands game, and it has returned in every single game since then. It wasn't as good in Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, but it was still a really effective fire SMG. Unfortunately though, as a weapon in Borderlands 3, it's just an embarrassment. It's gotten a couple of buffs, but nothing has made it even remotely useful in the game. The Hellfire should have been so much better in this game, especially since, unlike in Borderlands 2, your main enemy is actually bandits and not armored soldiers and robots. The thing that really made this gun overpowered in the original Borderlands is that its incendiary dot effect would stack on enemies, meaning that its 3000 fire damage per second could apply itself more than once at the same time to the same enemy. And that's what Gearbox needs to bring back to buff this gun. Just that one simple change would make this gun an A tier weapon like it deserves to be, and also a damage buff, of course. Like I said before, there are a lot of guns that need a buff in this game. However, that also brings up an interesting point that a lot of people have raised. If all of the guns in Borderlands 3 perform the same, then there is no such thing as a good or bad gun. Borderlands needs to have bad guns so that it can have good guns, and that makes total sense to me, but it's just a little disappointing to see a lot of the bad guns be fan favorites from previous games. But anyway, that's gonna wrap up this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see all of you in the next one.